The United Kingdom has a new government led by the Labour Party, and its Prime Minister is Keir Starmer. Today I'm going to talk about who Keir Starmer is, his very shady ties to British intelligence and to US government organizations, and the fact that Keir Starmer rose to power demonstrates how the British government is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. And if we simply look at the results of the July election held in the UK, we can clearly see how undemocratic this system is. The Labour Party only won roughly 34% of the votes, and yet it got 65% of the seats in Parliament. This means that Labour has created a majority government with the lowest vote share in British history. And the leader of the British Labour Party and the new Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is the perfect symbol of the political establishment in the country. He really is the new Tony Blair. And this has been acknowledged even by mainstream media outlets like Foreign Policy, which referred to him as the new Tony Blair. Who was Blair? He was the British Prime Minister who allied with George Bush, the Republican in the US, in order to invade Iraq, and a crime against humanity that led to the deaths of more than 1 million Iraqis. Keir Starmer follows in the footsteps of Tony Blair. Both of these figures are products of the so-called New Labour movement that arose in the 1990s when, with the end of the First Cold War, they declared that the Labour Party and other social democratic parties should move to the right. They should abandon the working class and unions, that is labor in their name, and instead they should embrace capital. They should become diehard capitalists and embrace neoliberal economics. This is exactly what happened under Tony Blair, and it's continuing today under Keir Starmer. In fact, when Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, before he became Prime Minister, when he was still in opposition, he openly opposed a call to increase taxes on big corporations. There is nothing left-wing at all about Keir Starmer. He is the poster boy of the center-right neoliberal establishment, and especially when it comes to foreign policy, empire, and war. Keir Starmer strongly supports Israel and has supported Israel as it's carried out horrific crimes against humanity in Gaza. He wants to continue arming Ukraine in the proxy war against Russia. He wants to strengthen NATO and expand Europe's military footprint around the world. And he supports the US-led new Cold War on China. Immediately after Starmer came to office, he published a video, which obviously was orchestrated. I mean, this is not an organic video. But in this video, you can hear Starmer speaking on the phone with US President Joe Biden. And this is presumably the first time that they spoke since he became Prime Minister. And at least according to this orchestrated call, the first thing that they discuss is how they can work together to wage proxy war against Russia in Ukraine and to try to contain China in the new Cold War. It's the first thing that the US and the UK discuss. Here is this very revealing clip.
Thank you very much for your congratulations. And fortuitously, we will see each other next week. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in Washington and having the opportunity, obviously, to sit down properly.
I'm looking forward to it as well. There's no doubt that under your leadership, our two countries are going to continue our special relationship. We're working together just about every issue, supporting Ukraine, managing the competition with China, advancing cooperation in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS.
Firstly, the special relationship is obviously the bedrock, always has been, for our defence, for our security and prosperity, which obviously is central to our missions for government.
In that call, you can hear that Starmer talks about how important it is for the US and the UK to strengthen their special relationship. And this is not surprising because Keir Starmer is very closely linked to British intelligence and to the US government. And the British journalist Matt Kennard over at the website Declassified UK has done very important reporting showing just how shady these connections are. From 2008 to 2013, Keir Starmer was the Director of Public Prosecutions for the UK's Crown Prosecution Service. And at this time, by the way, he was overseeing the legal persecution of Julian Assange, the editor of WikiLeaks, the journalist who would later be imprisoned by the British regime for the so-called crime of doing journalism and exposing US war crimes that were committed with the complicity of the British regime. Anyway, the point is that during this time, as Keir Starmer was helping to oversee the prosecution of Assange, he took several shady trips to Washington to meet with top US government officials. And this journalist, Matt Kennard, asked for the records on Keir Starmer's trips to Washington. And what happened? The British Crown Prosecution Service said that none of those records existed because they had all been destroyed. This is extremely suspicious, to put it mildly. We really should be asking why the British government destroyed these very important documents that are not decades old. It's not like this is ancient history, but this is just scratching the surface of Keir Starmer's very shady ties. And we also know that Keir Starmer was part of the leaders of the Labour Party who sabotaged the former left-wing leader of Labour, who is anti-war and anti-imperialist, Jeremy Corbyn. And at this time, of course, I'm going to talk about Corbyn and how he was essentially ousted in a coup in which British intelligence agencies played a role in trying to destabilize and undermine him and replace him with Keir Starmer. But before that, I want to talk about a CIA-linked group that Keir Starmer is part of, which is the Trilateral Commission. This is a very shady organization created in the 1970s, and the reason it's called the Trilateral Commission is the trilogy in it consists of the United States, Europe, and Japan, the imperialist triad that until the last few decades dominated the global economy and global politics. And this commission was created by the billionaire capitalist oligarch David Rockefeller, who was very deeply involved not only on Wall Street, but also in helping to create State Department policy through organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations. David Rockefeller was essentially the capitalist oligarch who linked Wall Street to Washington, and he helped to create the Trilateral Commission in the 1970s in order to try to reimpose political control after the turbulent era of the 1960s and the early 1970s that saw mass protests and revolutions, famously in 1968, that also saw, for instance, in 1971, the end of the linkage of the dollar to gold when Nixon ended the gold standard. Then you had a series of inflation crises and geopolitical instability in the 1970s. So the Trilateral Commission was created to coordinate very secretively and undemocratically between the wealthy imperialist capitalist countries to try to maintain political control and economic control over the world. In 1975, the Trilateral Commission infamously published a document titled The Crisis of Democracy. This was a lengthy report that was co-authored by the infamous Harvard political scientist Samuel Huntington, who was one of the most influential political scientists in the US. He also had served in the US government, a senior role in the White House under President Jimmy Carter. And he was a notorious neoconservative. And Samuel Huntington famously wrote the book, The Clash of Civilizations, that argue that after the end of the First Cold War, that class politics was irrelevant, that economic conflict was irrelevant, and that instead political conflict would be a result of a clash of civilization, of culture. It was an attempt to erase any class analysis and have this very right-wing culturalist view of the world. And Samuel Huntington also had some quite authoritarian tendencies. I mean, obviously, he was a warmonger, and we can see this very clearly in this report that he co-wrote for the Trilateral Commission in 1975. In the conclusion of this report, they complained that there was a so-called excess of democracy, and they wrote that, quote, "The problems of governance in the United States today stem from an excess of democracy, and instead of an excess of democracy, what is needed is, quote, a greater degree of moderation in democracy." And they complained that in the 1960s, with the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War, with the civil rights movement, with the feminist movement, with all of these different progressive movements, they complained that in the 1960s, the democratic principle was spread too widely. So they're saying very clearly in the 1970s that we need an anti-democratic counter-revolution against these progressive movements. And this is exactly what happened with the rise of neoliberalism, of free market fundamentalism in the 1970s. In reality, neoliberalism was simply a class war by big capital, by big corporations and banks and billionaire oligarchs against the working class, against unions, against average people. And they were very successful, not only with right-wing cold warriors like Margaret Thatcher of the Conservative Party in the UK or Ronald Reagan of the Republican Party in the US, but also neoliberalism culminated with these so-called left-wing neoliberals who were actually just more center-right neoliberal leaders like Bill Clinton from the Democratic Party and Tony Blair in the Labour Party in the UK. They claim to be left-wing and progressive, but in reality were right-wing neoliberal capitalists who did not care about average working people. They only cared about big corporations and banks who funded them. And today, Keir Starmer follows directly in the footsteps of Bill Clinton, of Tony Blair. He represents the so-called third way, the neoliberal third way, where in the 90s and the 2000s, these neoliberal sophists claim that we need to find a third way in between the right and the left. This is what Keir Starmer represents. And it's not just organic. The rise of Keir Starmer is not the product of the grassroots. He has been supported by intelligence agencies, by the media, by the political establishment, and by big billionaire capitalist interests because they know he is going to support their economic interests. He's not going to increase taxes on corporations. He's not going to support the working class. There was a politician in the UK who in 2015 became leader of the Labour Party who did truly represent average working people in the UK. His name was Jeremy Corbyn, and immediately after he was elected the leader of the Labour Party in a landslide vote because he was so popular, the elites in the Labour Party conspired to overthrow him in an internal coup. This was admitted even in the mainstream British media, which was extremely antagonistic to Jeremy Corbyn, which spread lies and disinformation about him to try to destabilize and undermine him. And yet they admitted, according to leaked internal documents from the Labour Party, that top party elites backed by billionaire capitalist interests were conspiring to overthrow Jeremy Corbyn to prevent him from becoming Prime Minister. And it wasn't just the Labour Party itself. It was also British intelligence agencies and even US intelligence agencies. And the British journalist Matt Kennard has done such important work showing this. Earlier I mentioned that Keir Starmer became a member of the CIA-linked Trilateral Commission. Well, in the report exposing this, Matt Kennard pointed out that Keir Starmer spoke at an event organized by the Trilateral Commission in 2017 alongside former heads of MI5 and GCHQ, this is British intelligence. Matt Kennard has shown how Keir Starmer had very close ties with British intelligence, especially MI5 and MI6, and would have regular meetings with them, dinner and drinks with them. And in 2019, the former director of the CIA said, quote, "We will do our level best to stop Corbyn, Jeremy Corbyn, the left-wing Labour Party leader, from being elected as Prime Minister of the UK." The CIA's top former official admitted this. Moreover, the journalist Matt Kennard showed that British military and intelligence officials were the main sources for at least 34 major media stories that demonized Jeremy Corbyn, that tried to portray him as a danger to British national security. They tried to paint him as an anti-Semite because he supports Palestine and opposes Israeli apartheid and colonialism. So British military and intelligence officials collaborated with the media to spread these fake stories to demonize the most popular left-wing politician in the country. And later he was replaced with a center-right neoliberal Keir Starmer, Tony Blair disciple, and he became prime minister, despite the fact that his party only won 34% of the vote, and yet they got 65% of seats. The UK is not a democracy. You can see very clearly how this is, at best, a manipulated, orchestrated oligarchy. In fact, the Labour Party lost votes in the 2024 election compared to 2017 and 2019, when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. And the media spread all these lies claiming that Jeremy Corbyn would be unelectable. But in reality, Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got 12.9 million votes in 2017. In 2019, it got 10.3 million votes. And yet, Keir Starmer, who supposedly is more electable because he's a center-right neoliberal oligarch puppet who supports war, supports colonialism, opposes Palestinian rights, he only got 9.7 million votes, his Labour Party. Fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn did. And yet, his Labour Party got hundreds of more seats in Parliament than Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party did, despite the fact that Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party got millions more votes. This is not a democracy. This is an oligarchy. And we can see that Jeremy Corbyn truly represented the working class. He wanted to expand education. He wanted to refund the National Health Services, the NHS, the socialized health system, which has been underfunded over decades of neoliberal policies, the right-wing governments of the Tories, the Conservatives who were in power for 14 years, and the neoliberal Blairites. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to nationalize the railroads. Jeremy Corbyn wanted to strengthen unions. Jeremy Corbyn supported Palestinian human rights. He wanted to end support for Israeli colonialism. Jeremy Corbyn opposed the proxy war against Russia. Jeremy Corbyn opposed the new Cold War on China. And yet, British military and intelligence officials conspired with the media to demonize and lie about Corbyn, to undermine him, to destabilize him, to prevent him from becoming prime minister. The former director of the CIA said that they would try to prevent Corbyn from becoming prime minister. They succeeded in orchestrating this ridiculous campaign to demonize him. And instead, the center-right neoliberal warmonger Keir Starmer became prime minister. This is what happened. Of course, the mainstream corporate media won't say that because they played a key role in undermining Corbyn and helping install Keir Starmer. But that's why we here at Geopolitical Economy Report, we do the work that we do, because we want to help inform people about what actually is going on and cut through some of that corporate media disinformation. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.